Welcome to the Wheats on Your Mind podcast. My name is Aaron Harries. Wheats on Your Mind is brought to you by the Kansas Wheat Commission and Kansas Association of Wheat Growers. On this episode of the podcast, our guest is Mike Spier with U.S. Wheat Associates. Mike Spier was elected by U.S. Wheat Associates as the organization's next president and CEO and officially assumed that role on July 1st of 2025. He previously served as U.S. Wheat's Vice President of Overseas Operation and has decades of experience in international wheat merchandising and market developing. Mike, thanks for joining us on the podcast.
Great. Thanks, Aaron. Thanks for having me on. A pleasure to be here.
Should mention, got our CEO, Justin Gilpin, by my side here joining us, and glad to have this conversation with you. First of all, congratulations on your new position as CEO of U.S. Wheat Associates. To help our audience out, give us a little bit of your background on your career path and how you got to U.S. Wheat Associates.
Thanks, Aaron. Thank you for that introduction. As you mentioned, I've been in the wheat industry for my entire career, which is about 34 years now. I started in the wheat industry working for a major exporting company, United Grain Corporation, on the West Coast, and then joined U.S. Wheat Associates in the Portland office as assistant director. And then from there, I worked in our overseas offices. First was in Cairo, Egypt, covered the Middle East, East Africa. From there to Manila, the Philippines, and also worked in the Singapore office, covering the South and Southeast Asia region for about 15 years there. And then, as you mentioned in your introduction, I've also combined probably about over a little 10 years experience in working for two international grain companies, United Grain and Columbia Grain.
Your international travels and being in different U.S. Wheat offices around the world, did you ever think you'd end up doing that in your career path? And what made you fall in love with that line of work?
No, that wasn't really on my radar when I first got out of college. I graduated college in accounting and started to work for, as I mentioned, for United Grain. My aunt and uncle grew up on a farm, raised wheat, corn, and potatoes. So I had a very, strong passion for agricultural from them. But living overseas, really wasn't on my radar. But I think over 20 years, I think my wife and I lived overseas, and it was a great experience. And kind of really being on the front lines for the U.S. wheat producers out there, promoting different U.S. wheat classes and working with buyers, and just something I've really enjoyed.
So remind everybody how many offices U.S. Wheat does have around the world.
Yeah, so we have 13 offices around the world and 3 offices in the United States: Portland, Oregon, Arlington, and Manhattan, Kansas.
Okay, and some of those offices are celebrating some anniversaries this year.
Yeah, that's right. Thanks. Yeah, we have 2 coming up here in April. Our Tokyo office is celebrating their 70th anniversary, and our Taipei office in Taiwan is the 60th anniversary.
Justin, I think you're planning on maybe going to some of those.
Yeah, I think we'll have the opportunity to attend those and see some of the relationships we've had with long-term customers in those regions. But it's always great to be able to see the established relationship that U.S. Wheat has with our buyers. I mean, that they are the face of the U.S. wheat farmer as we're out promoting the crop that we grow every year, and having special events like that will be pretty unique experience. And it's a good year to be able to do it because we've got a good crop to talk about. Exports have been good, and it's a dynamic time with everything that's happened in the trade world and geopolitics. And so reaffirming those relationships and having that already in place with the work that U.S. Wheat's done is going to be, I look forward to being able to participate in that. So just real quick, I want to just be able to follow up on that, because I think when I first met Mike was early in his career, and he's, has such a unique experience with his time that he spent in Cairo and then also Manila and then Singapore. But, along the way, Mike, you did get to work with some people that have been able to teach us quite a bit when you were at those locations. And as earlier in your career, as you're experiencing that overseas expat experience, maybe mention 1 or 2 people that you were able to work for or work with that have kind of been influential in your career.
Yeah, that's a great question there. I think right who comes to mind is John Oates, director of the West Coast office. Actually hired me from the grain trade, and I think he just provided a lot of knowledge. His knowledge of the U.S. wheat marketing system, from the farmer level to the grain grading system, the export level, was really significant. I think played a big part in terms of my career path. But I think John Oates, and then Dick Prowder would be another one in Egypt. Egypt was the first post for my wife and I overseas. And, coming from Oregon to Egypt was quite a transition, as you can imagine. He was just very helpful, not only just in terms of, getting to understand the markets, getting to understand our customers, but also just living overseas, it very helped. So, there were two that would come to kind of top of mind.
What an interesting time to be in Egypt. During our careers, we've really seen the balance of global trade, and it really change. And I think the Mediterranean, North Africa was really on the front lines of that as, one of our top customer areas when you were there, and while you were there, it was the beginning of the increase in production in some of the Black Sea and those relationship with some of those buyers. But maybe touch a little bit on what your experience was like as you've seen some of that transformation that's happened in global trade, and how we've had to maybe make some adjustments and an evolution on how we really target our markets and where we have advantages and where we are at a disadvantage because of logistics and price.
Yeah, I think, looking at, kind of when we started our careers, there was a lot of government buyers around the world. As you mentioned, in Egypt was one of the largest buyers of wheat, a lot of out of the Gulf at the time. U.S. Wheat had a big share of Egypt's imports at that time. I think about 50% of the government imports, and then probably 90% of the private imports. And this is back in the early 90s. So I think we've seen, as you kind of talked about in our careers, we've seen that shift from the larger government buyers to the privatization of the flour milling industry, which has just, I think, created a lot of demand for education, a lot of training. I think that the State Wheat Commission's U.S. Wheat Associates, our partnership, has been able to really work together and kind of train those new mills that have come up. I don't have on the top of my head the number of mills, private mills you have now in Egypt, but another market where we've seen just an increase in privatization is looking in Indonesia. Indonesia is one of the largest buyers of wheat in the world. Going back in probably the early 90s, I think that there was probably 5 milling companies. Today you have over 30. So that's just an increase in terms of the amount of technical training for the flour mills, for the buyers. The U.S. Wheat and I think the State Wheat Commissions really work well to train those, and just kind of the changes we've seen over the years.
Mike, I know you've probably hit the ground running, hopping around the world, visiting those offices, trying to catch up with everybody in the first 90 to 100 days. So what are some of your first priorities on the first year as CEO of U.S. Wheat Associates?
Yeah, well, you hit one of the top priorities, and that was really getting out to kind of strengthen and build on the relationships that we've had over the years. U.S. Wheat, I think, over the last 45 years, has built a lot of strong relationships and is really kind of the foundation, I think, of our organization, and be able to work with buyers and access markets overseas. So that's a top priority. I think another top priority is also to continue to look for ways to increase exports and U.S. wheat market share in key importing regions. Another priority is driving innovation, not only in our overseas offices, our offices domestically, but driving innovation, new activities, not only on activities, but in new processes that we have, different ways we can do things, taking advantage of new digital tools out there, looking at ways that we can do things differently. Also enhancing our producer outreach. I think that's super important, and I just kind of thank you for what you're doing here and what Justin does in terms of getting the message out, what U.S. Wheat is doing. I think that's continuing to be a significant, important part of what we do, but really I think that helps build the confidence in what we're doing, and also provides, I think, a little bit more of information on the impact that U.S. Wheat delivers. And then I think also making use of the additional funding that we have from USDA for our overseas operations, and with that also comes adding some new staff overseas to be able to handle that additional workload and really provide more value back to Kansas wheat farmers and other wheat farmers in the U.S.
Yeah, tell us about some of those key staff changes and maybe additions in personnel that some might not be familiar with.
So I think just since I started last July, we had some key retirements of employees that have had several years with U.S. Wheat, but also made some strategic hires as well. We've added a consultant in Brazil. We've added a technical consultant in Italy. We've also added a milling and baking specialist in our U.S. Wheat Casablanca office, added another technical specialist in Singapore for the Southeast Asia, hired an additional admin assistant in our Cape Town office. We've also last year, back in May, also added more staff in the U.S. Wheat Mexico City office, technical office there, to really expand on our efforts there. So I think with those roles, we also have, I think, Justin talked about, I think, kind of, U.S. Wheat years ago. Years ago, U.S. Wheat had 14 U.S. citizens overseas. But I think just with the trends in our USDA funding that we had, we've seen that, I think, number of U.S. Wheat citizens that are working for U.S. Wheat Associates overseas shrink down to about 6. My goal is to kind of turn that around a little bit, and we're doing that now with adding a new assistant regional director, Tyler Ledford, who was our marketing analyst, moving her to the Philippines here at the end of March. And so we think we've had some exciting moves, I think, both, like I said, some replacing some retirements and also some strategic moves. And a little bit closer to home to you, I think, has been fantastic for us is Julie Debus on our communication side. So she's been a great addition. She was with U.S. Wheat before. We're just so happy to have her back with us.
Addition of the Vice President of Overseas Operations had some pretty big shoes to fill, but glad to see Brian hitting the ground running. And, it's interesting that we talk about Italy. Aaron, I just saw a TikTok video posted by Mel Gibson, Mad Max, and he was talking about how
I'm old enough to remember that,
how good the food is and pasta is in Italy because it's so much better for him than in the U.S. And maybe this is a good time to remind Mad Max that actually a lot of that wheat is coming from the United States. And so I'm not good enough to know how to reply to a TikTok video, but I want to.
Speaking of the Chinese,
that's an excellent point. I think, and we're kind of looking at that. Some, as I mentioned, some of our innovation and new activities ideas. Just kind of comments like that or misinformation out there about wheat. So we're kind of looking at some of our key markets where we have large market shares and looking at doing some consumption campaigns there to kind of get out more information about the health benefits of wheat. Really, the positive story about wheat to kind of balance some of those other like TikTok things you're mentioning there as well. But I think that'll really help, get out there because wheat has a great message, a great story, and I think we need to continue to tell that. And I think overseas we have opportunities not only to change the perception of wheat, also be able to drive demand by increasing that.
Some of the work that you started in relationships in Southeast Asia, and especially when you look at the Philippines, the work that's being done there by Joe Bippert and Joe Sowers. I think we got some really good examples of what we maybe even want to try to build on here in the U.S. and some of the messaging that they've been able to accomplish in working with their customers, but then also ultimately consumer messaging around wheat in the Philippines. Some great stories U.S. Wheat's doing.
Yeah, that's right. And I think you said Joe Bippert, Joe Sowers doing an incredible job there. And we think we kind of want to take that model that we've used in the Philippines on the consumption campaign there and look at it other markets. Mexico would be another example and some other markets too in South America.
It's been a really good export year for U.S. wheat so far, the marketing year ending in May. There's always an ebb and flow to that, but what do you see going forward for the rest of the year?
I'm really, excited about our exports that we've had this year. All U.S. wheat sales are up about 18% compared to the same time last year. And I think hard winter wheat farmers in Kansas would be happy to know that probably the majority of that increase in export sales has come through additional hard red winter wheat exports. Hard red winter wheat exports are about 90 million bushels compared to the same time last year. And that's when you're looking at with that increased sales, when we've had a significant increase in competition among the major exporters around the world. You have Argentina, record crop, Canada, record crop, Australia, second largest crop on record, and Russia, almost a near record crop. So with this, this intensive increased competition we're still seeing U.S. wheat exports. And I think that just demonstrates the value that buyers around the world see in hard red winter wheat and other classes of U.S. wheat, because there's other options out there. But I think that's where we really work well together with Kansas Wheat Commission, other state wheat commissions, the international grain programs, U.S. Wheat Associates. All our activities combined are really keeping U.S. wheat in front of the buyer's mind, even when there's a lot of other options out there, and in some markets, probably options that are a little less expensive compared to U.S. wheat as well.
That diversity of marketplace makes wheat so unique in that we're not relying on just one or two customers as some of our other commodity brethren are sometimes. And it seems for the most part the tariff issue is kind of touchy, but our wheat markets aren't as hard hit as some of the other ones, right?
That's a good point. I think in terms of diversification, I just kind of want to point that out too, was when we were having meetings back in DC last week at our board meeting with USDA, it was mentioned that U.S. Wheat Associates is one of the most, if not the most diversified in terms of markets that we're exporting to out of all the cooperators. So as you point out, we're not just relying on one market.
And through the advocacy of the wheat organizations, there's been increase in funding for some of the export funds that are used by U.S. Wheat Associates from MAP and FMD funds. What does that increased funding mean for the organization? I know in some ways it's just keeping up with inflation, but how are you going to use those resources?
That's another, I think, want to show appreciation and thanks for the state wheat commissions and grower groups that really, I think, have done an incredible job of communicating to USDA we're needing for that increased funding, particularly in the FMD and MAP programs. Those programs have been similar funding levels for the last 20 years, and even though you've seen inflation and other costs go up for operating overseas. So this additional funding that we have through the USDA programs for our overseas operations is going to be very helpful in terms of being able to conduct more activities, be more innovative in terms of our activities that we're doing. Let us take out a little bit some more risks on activities that we normally wouldn't do when we didn't have that additional funding.
Well, let's talk about some of the emerging marketplaces. You mentioned Indonesia and some of the potential there. What about Central and South America for our hard red winter wheat farms? I mean, there's emerging and growing markets, but also some different uses. I mean, we've even talked about the aquaculture industry in Central and South America.
Yeah, that's a good point, and I think we had some ideas, I think, from Justin and yourself on ways that we could use some of the new funding, and really appreciate that. And one of them was looking at the aquaculture market down there, looking at ways to use hard red winter wheat for feeding shrimp, and that's kind of a new market development. Gives us another opportunity, I think, for just increasing usage of U.S. wheat. And it kind of touches going back on your question on tariffs too, where we really haven't seen, I think, a negative impact on tariffs, and also your emerging market question. Looking at Bangladesh probably buys, I think, upwards to 5-6 million metric tons a year of wheat, but they primarily have been looking at buying wheat just primarily based on price. But when the new tariffs went in place last year, the governor of Bangladesh was looking for ways to balance their trade deficit with the U.S., and one of those ways was to import U.S. agricultural products. One of them is wheat. U.S. Wheat Associates, our office in Southeast Asia, Joe Sowers and Joe Bippert signed a memorandum of understanding with the government of Bangladesh for 5-year purchase commitment. And that's 700,000 metric tons a year for the next 5 years. This year, Bangladesh has met that. I think they're about 675,000, still a little bit to go in the marketing year, but that's record sales of U.S. wheat to Bangladesh. That's new hard red winter wheat sales that we haven't had there before. And so I think that kind of, on your question about tariffs and also an emerging market as well.
The one question I was going to ask, Mike, is about logistics. You have a lot of experience in that, and we talked about U.S. flagged vessels, but what are some of the issues in the logistics side of exports that U.S. Wheat Associates is dealing with right now?
On the logistics, I think the U.S. flagged vessels, that would come into play for food aid shipments. On the logistics side, I think I think we have some of the best in terms of infrastructure in the world, transportation, logistics that we have here. I think in terms of challenges on logistics side, we'd be more looking when buyers are looking at the landed price of wheat. Price of wheat from the Black Sea versus harder winter wheat. It really depends on that ocean freight as well. In terms of when they're looking at what's the most cost-effective wheat for them, looking at landed price. So on the logistics side, I think kind of goes in cycles in terms of, when our most competitive time is, usually October, November, December. You have some challenges just with loading corn, wheat, and soybeans. That's been a little bit different this year with the changes in exports going to China for soybeans and corn.
Even closer to home here, when we talk about logistics, there's so many influences that impact producer profitability and what the cost of our wheat is on that landed basis. But closer to home here, rail transportation and that impact to one of our largest market on direct rail shipments that go into Mexico, which is basically a an extension of our domestic market. Do appreciate U.S. wheat and at the national level, raising concerns about the Class 1 proposed merger and the lack of competition and what that might mean. Ultimately, farmers are paying the freight both ways a lot of times. And so things like that are out of our control, but where we can try to at least be a voice on behalf of farmers, we do appreciate U.S. wheat's being vocal about concerns and making sure that isn't lost in those discussions. But when we think about what do we need to be doing to be competitive and try to help on those returns for farmers, we got to be conscious of what our customers are going to want, but yet we also have to find ways to drive our production efficiency at the acre level. And so it's a combination of, you get caught into sustainability discussions where that might try to create value, or there's specific quality parameters that might add value, and then how do we do that while we're still doing adoption of technology so that we're driving efficiencies for the farmer.
Well, I just want to thank you for all your work that you're doing on the rail side and working on this merger. I mean, you've been at the forefront of that for many years, so just thank you for that. In terms, I think, on looking on sustainability, we've seen wheat buyers view sustainability a little bit different compared to buyers of soybeans, corn, or cotton. So there's been, I think, less demand for a formal certification program. But I think bottom line, we look at sustainability for information that we need to provide based on the customer needs. We're looking at, broad science-based data for most buyers, and our life cycle assessment that we've done, which shows long-term, I think, improvements in carbon footprint, soil erosion, water use efficiency across the U.S. wheat industry, is good for some buyers. And then there's some more detailed certification that's needed for customers with specific requirements. So we're looking at meeting those requirements when they come up.
That communication directly with the buyer about what's coming forward, it's not just, as you're restructuring or kind of refilling positions within the staff of U.S. Wheat Associates, but that grower leader component is also right alongside of you when you are a lot of times out visiting with customers. And we're really fortunate to have one of our commissioners now that is serving on the exec team with U.S. Wheat Associates, and so with Gary Miller-Shasky out of Lakin. But maybe talk a little bit about how important it is to be seen as that U.S. wheat farmer organization, and to have those leaders that are making that commitment and involvement and working alongside of U.S. wheat staff and with our buyers.
Yeah, that's incredibly important. Gary Miller-Shasky does a great job overseas. I think U.S. wheat staff, we can talk about situations that are going on in the U.S., but when a customer overseas really hears it directly from a farmer, it has a lot of impact. And Gary Miller-Shasky does an incredible job, I think, talking about not only his farm, what's going on with him, but all farmers across the U.S., and has just done a fantastic job for Kansas and for U.S. wheat farmers. When, I think really now when, going overseas, and Gary has joined Brian Liedl, our Vice President of Overseas Operations, and myself on several trips, and those first initial visits, getting out, visiting key customers, Mexico, Indonesia, South Korea. Gary Miller-Shasky joined us on those trips. And, we talked to a lot of buyers, and the buyers were talking about wheat prices. And they're like, yeah, wheat prices are great. They're low. And then, hearing from Gary talking about how maybe those low wheat prices aren't as beneficial for wheat farmers, and getting them to hear and to understand that, I think is very helpful in terms of looking at input costs really are higher compared to where wheat prices are today. So that's something that a message, I think, is really well delivered by a farmer rather than a U.S. wheat staff.
Well, Mike, we appreciate your time and good luck on your tenure. I know you just came away from recently from NOG and U.S. Wheat Associate joint meetings in D.C. Any big takeaways from those meetings up there on Capitol Hill?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of positive momentum, and I think there's a lot of positive excitement in terms of wheat farmers. I think, listen to some of the meetings that we had with administration officials. They're really talking about getting back to promoting U.S. wheat farmers and all the work that U.S. wheat farmers do. And I think showing, more respect for our U.S. wheat farmers. I mean, we're not only feeding the United States, U.S. wheat farmers are feeding mouths around the world, and just how important and how critical that is. So I was really, I think, excited to hear about that. And I think it just, I think those meetings went great.
And I think one of the recent victories is the Food for Peace program being moved over to USDA and have some sales there too.
Yeah, we had some sales to Kenya, I think, just recently as well. So yeah, I mean, they're doing a lot, and I think it's going to be a great year for the U.S. wheat farmer.
All right. Well, we'll end that on that good note. Again, Mike, thanks for your time, and best of luck to you, and look forward to working with you in the future U.S. Wheat Associates.
I'd also like to add, we look forward to hosting you here in a year and a half when we'll be having the U.S. Wheat Summer Meeting here in Manhattan, Kansas. And so I think that'll be a great opportunity to get leaders from across the organization and different wheat classes, and look forward to having your organization here and hosting that for several days here in Manhattan in the summer of 27.
Yeah, thank you. Look forward to that. Yeah, thank you for your time. Just thank you for everything you guys are doing, both Aaron and Justin and just your entire staff. And I also want to say congratulations to Cindy Falk. I heard recently that after 40 years, she's going to be retiring. So just want to congratulate her and thank her for all her work.
We'll miss the bread samples around here. That's for sure. And
bread samples. I would send some of those my way.
Yeah. We'll invite Cindy back in to maybe help out with that. Thanks again, Mike.
Thank you.
My thanks to Mike Spier with U.S. Wheat Associates for being the guest on this episode of the Wheats on Your Mind podcast. You can find all previous episodes of the podcast at wheatsonyourmind.com. Thank you for listening.